Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Bob Gabe. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the American Diabetes Association, and you have joined Ask Dr. Bob. This is our regular show. It's our fourth episode, actually, where we allow you to ask questions of me. And I do my best to answer whatever questions you might have. And so this month, being that it is Black History Month, we received a number of questions along those lines. And so I'll go through them, but I'll also have you keep in mind that in the chat, if you have other questions, please throw them in. And as time permits, we'll get to all of those. And if not, we'll save some for the next time around. So without further ado, let me pull up the questions. And well, before I get to the questions, let me just remind people about some sobering statistics about the impact of diabetes on the African American community. And I'll just share three of them, but there are lots, sadly. So first, African Americans are 50% more likely to develop diabetes. And so we'll talk about that in some of the questions as to why. The second fact is when they develop diabetes, they're 2 times as likely to die from their diabetes as non-Blacks. And so obviously a big concern there. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third statistic is around amputations. And many of you may know people, unfortunately, that have experienced that. So the risk of amputations for Blacks, for African Americans, is 3 times higher than the rest of the community. And so really a big concern in an area where the American Diabetes Association has taken an important lead in a number of ways, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go along. But specifically around amputations, we're working with many other partners to tackle this. It's unacceptable that people should lose their limbs to diabetes. We can and must and will do better with all of your help. So let me now start with some of the questions here, and I'll pull them up. So the first question is, a good general question. Which type of diabetes is more prevalent, more common in diabetes? Is it type 1 or type 2 in the African American community? And why is that? And so let me just give you a quick review, difference between type 1 and type 2. You heard me, first of all, say that people, that African Americans are twice as likely to develop diabetes. And the type of diabetes they're more likely to develop is type 2 diabetes. So what is type 2 diabetes and how is it different than type 1? Well, let me start with that. So type 2 diabetes, which is what 90% of people in the US with diabetes have, so it's the most common form of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is caused by 2 problems. One, people become resistant to the effects of a hormone that helps control blood sugar, and that hormone is called insulin. You may have heard of that, of course. They become resistant to the effects of insulin. And so what they do and how they compensate is they make lots more insulin. And most people are able to make lots more insulin, and therefore they're able to keep their blood sugars normal, and they don't have diabetes. But a subset of those people can't make that extra insulin. And when they can't make that extra insulin, now their blood sugars begin to rise and they have diabetes. And so for people with type 2 diabetes, it's those 2 problems: resistant to the effects of insulin and not able to make enough insulin to compensate. So why is this true in the African American community, that there is this higher rate of type 2 diabetes? And it's probably a number of factors. We know that there are some risk factors for developing diabetes, and those are more common. So being overweight or obese makes you more likely to develop diabetes. Hypertension is a risk factor. Cholesterol issues is a risk factor. And all of those tend to be more common in African Americans. And then there are these social factors. So poverty makes you more likely to have diabetes. Uh, People with lower education are more likely to develop diabetes. And if you look at the African American community, on average, unfortunately, uh, they have a larger percentage of people that may not have completed college, that live in poverty, that don't have access to healthy foods, um, all of which increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So, something we certainly need to do something about. Um, and so the next question sort of connects to that. So the questioner says, since diabetes is quite common in the African American community, how young should I get my child checked out for diabetes? Well, first of all, let me tell you that about a third of people with diabetes don't know they have it. And so that's why this question is really an important one. We need to screen people so that we can catch it early, so that we can manage their diabetes and prevent the complications like the amputations I described earlier. So, what are the recommendations for kids? Well, the risk of diabetes in kids, and again, I'm talking about type 2 diabetes here. Um, the risk of type 2 diabetes for kids really relates to them being overweight or obese. And so, if they are either overweight or have obesity, then starting at age 10, they should be screened with a simple blood test to think about that. So it's overweight or obese and one risk factor of those risk factors I said. So in other words, if they have a family history of diabetes and they're overweight or obese, yep, they should be screened starting at age 10 because they could develop diabetes. And one of the fast growing areas of people with diabetes are younger people, are children with type 2 diabetes. So, but let me also say, what about adults? When should we screen for diabetes in adults if one third of people are undiagnosed? And we know that if we catch people early, we can treat them and prevent complications. We want to screen people. When do we screen them? Well, it again gets down to the risk factors. So if they have risk factors for diabetes, that's one group. If they have no risk factors, and again, I'll say this in a second, if they have no risk factors, starting age 45. But if they are overweight, um, and one risk factor like a family history of diabetes, or considered a risk factor as being African American, being Native American, being Asian American, even at a lower body mass index, even at a lower level of obesity, being Latino, all of those are risk factors. Those people should be screened much earlier, probably at age 30. So no risk factors 45, risk factors age 30, because people are developing diabetes and they don't know it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about that. Let me now jump ahead to the next question. So we talked about why is it more common? What are some of the causes of diabetes? We talked a little bit about the risk factors and screening. And now, an important question. Are there any healthy lifestyle tips you can offer to help prevent or prolong getting diabetes? So people are at risk, but it doesn't mean they have to develop diabetes. And yes, there's a number of things you can do. Um, One program that I'll tell you that the American Diabetes Association is doing in collaboration with the Center for Disease Control is a program that we offer and is available around the country by many others as well, called the Diabetes Prevention Program. And that is a program that has been demonstrated to reduce the risk of diabetes by 2/3. So, really lowering the risk a lot. Um, and it's a lifestyle program. And what it involves is helping people to exercise a bit more, uh, getting them to a target of doing a good walk, 150 minutes a week. How does that translate for you? It could be something as simple as 10,000 steps a day. Uh, if you have a phone, uh, many smartphones measure your steps. You carry your phone with you, look up what your steps are, see where you're going, try to move in that direction, try to increase the number of steps. So, physical activity, one healthy lifestyle, and the other is thinking about what you eat. Um, and eating healthier foods, um, watching your portion control, the amount that you eat. So it's what you eat and it's how much you eat. Um, and the American Diabetes Association website has a whole host of resources to help you think about this, including something called the Food Hub, which has hundreds of recipes, healthy recipes that you can use at home to think about eating more healthy. So there are a lot of tips about healthy lifestyles to consider. Let me move to the next question. And again, if you have questions, please put it in the chat and we will get to them. So I'm going to continue on. Um, when it comes to diabetes in the African American community, is it genetic? Well, there are certain genetic risks associated with developing type 2 diabetes. And um, yes, it probably is half genetic and half the environment. So we don't control our genes and we don't control who our parents are, but we can control how we interact in the environment. And that's really where those healthy lifestyles are important. Um, and that genetic basis is probably something that, you know, way back in history was really helpful. It helped people store food effectively because through most of human civilization, there wasn't enough food. And the advantage, evolutionary advantage, was to people that could store food very efficiently and therefore survive when there wasn't a lot of food around. Well, now we're obviously in a different environment. We have lots of food around. And that ability to store that food better, not such a good thing. And that's part of that increased risk. So, another question that comes up is do signs and symptoms of diabetes before the diagnosis appear different for people of color? And the answer is not really for the most part. The classic symptoms of having diabetes, excessive thirst, excessive urination, um, blurry vision, for women developing yeast infections, um, all of those are the same for all people. But there is a particular skin condition that may be more noticeable in African Americans and people of color, but it occurs in everyone. And it has a complicated name. It's called acanthosis nigricans. Acanthosis nigricans. And what it is it's a dark discoloration of the skin. It's flat, so it's not bumpy. And it's this often in the back of the neck or under the arms where you can see it. And that discoloration that is, sort of permanent can be a sign of being resistant to the effects of insulin. And an early sign that you might be at risk for diabetes. Let me say something about risk for diabetes for all of you, and we can try to put this in the chat. So if you're wondering, am I at risk for diabetes and how can I find out? We've got an answer for you. On our American Diabetes Association website, we have a very simple risk test. It's a 1-minute quiz, just asks you a bunch of questions about yourself that's confidential, and it will tell you what your risk is of having diabetes. And so I recommend, if you're concerned or think about it, take the risk test. It takes a minute. You'll know where you're at. Okay, let's move along to the next question here. Um, are there any diabetes resources people from the American community can refer to? Absolutely. And we'll put in the chat a resource area on um, the American Diabetes Association website, diabetes.org, where you'll find lots of resources from affordability of insulin and medications to what can you eat to exercise things, all sorts of good stuff. So please take a look there. Here's another question, and this person says a lot of people tie obesity to diabetes, and that's true. Um, but they say I am not overweight at all, and I still have diabetes. What are some of the other causes? Well, that's an important one. So, not all people with diabetes have obesity. The majority of people with type 2 diabetes do, but there's another form of diabetes that I mentioned earlier called type 1 diabetes. It's about 10% of people with diabetes, about 1.5 million people in the US, and their disease is caused by something different. Um, it is an autoimmune disease. Their body's immune system, which, as you know, normally fights infections, what it does is instead it attacks the cells of the body that make insulin, and it destroys them so they can make no insulin. And because they make no insulin, the only treatment for them is to take insulin. Um, and they tend not to be overweight at all. Many are thin, and so again, that's the disconnect. But you can have, interestingly, if you think about Asian Americans, they develop diabetes at a much lower degree of body weight than the rest of the population. And therefore, we recommend screening Asian Americans at a much lower body weight and level of overweightedness, if that's a word. It's not really, but at a much lower level of overweightedness, which we measure by something called a body mass index. You may have heard this, BMI. And being overweight is a cutoff. We use a lower cutoff for people who are Asian Americans because their level of obesity around their organs internally is higher than would appear just by looking at them. You might see somebody and say, wow, they don't look overweight at all. But in the Asian American community, they have a fair amount of um, fat around their organs that puts them at risk for diabetes. So uh, uh, that that explains a little bit some of the different ways that people can be overweight, not overweight, and still develop diabetes. Let me also mention something else that that is an important risk factor for diabetes, for type 2 diabetes. And that's having, for women, having a history of gestational diabetes. So, in other words, having diabetes during pregnancy, for many women, it goes away after they deliver. But half of those women will develop type 2 diabetes within the next 10 years. So, having had a history of diabetes during pregnancy, what we call gestational diabetes, big risk factor for developing diabetes. And those people should continue to be screened for the development of sort of more long lasting diabetes for type 2 diabetes after their delivery. So, we went through a bunch of questions. Let me see if we have some others here. Um, how can I reduce my complications and side effects of diabetes medications? Well, so let me take that. That's sort of two questions. So, how can I reduce my complications of diabetes? Let's start with, why do people with diabetes develop complications? And most of the complications that we associate with diabetes are related to high blood sugars. So it's high blood sugars that ultimately leads to, if not treated, um, eye disease and blindness. So diabetes, sadly, continues to be leading cause of blindness. It is also the leading cause of kidney failure. And so high blood sugars over many years can lead to kidney failure, and the risk of amputation as well is related to blood sugar. The other two things, along with blood sugars being elevated, are blood pressure and cholesterol. So, you know, you may know that we measure blood sugar levels with something called an A1C test, which gives an average of what the blood sugars have been over the last 3 months. That A1C value really relates to your risk of developing these complications, but there's good news. The good news is, if you lower your A1C, in other words, you get better blood sugar control, your risk of complications goes way down. And so the good news is, you're in control and you can reduce your risk of complications by focusing on A1C, blood pressure, and cholesterol. A, B, C. So let me see if we have more questions. So another one is, what is a Dexcom? Well, Dexcom is an example of a tool that we have in diabetes now over the last several years, that is a continuous glucose monitor. So I said that controlling your blood sugar and lowering your blood sugar into the closer to the normal range can prevent these complications of diabetes. Well, how do you do that? Well, part of it is, you have to know what it is. You have to measure it and see, if you do this and do that, is it coming down, and keep a track of it. Well, how can you do that? One way is measuring your blood sugar by a finger stick. And you've probably seen people prick their fingers and put the blood on a strip and measure it, and the meter reads out what their value is. These continuous glucose monitors are sort of the next level of that. What they do is, they measure your blood sugar continuously. You wear a little thing either on your belly or on your arm, and there are different brands of this that are available. And what it does is, it measures your blood sugar continuously, and so you can see what your number is at any given time, and you can set it to alarm you if your blood sugar gets too low or too high. And they're called continuous glucose monitors, and really very helpful tools for people with diabetes. We, I mean, they're great. They're a game changer. Absolutely. Um, you know, as we were talking earlier about Black History Month, I want to call your attention to another resource that the ADA has, and that's something that we launched last year after realizing that it's been too long where these statistics about uh, the health disparities that African Americans and people of color have suffered. We need to do something about this. The the social unrest this past summer shined a bright light on that. COVID shined a bright light on that. Uh, uh, African Americans are 6 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID. So, what are we going to do about that? And that's where the American Diabetes Association has launched this incredible effort called Health Equity Now. And it includes a Bill of Rights for people with diabetes. There are 10 Bill of Rights. I encourage you to go to our website to see that. And we're running out of time, so I will let you go to that in a moment. But let me say, we'll post that in the chat. It's a great resource for where we're going and how we're partnering with organizations around the country to really tackle these issues of amputation rates being 3 times higher in people of color. All of these terrible statistics, we don't want that to go on anymore. And so we want to do something about it. I think I may have time for another question. Um, And um, that question would be, oops, we lost that question. So let me see if we have any others. It looks like we're out of time already. So I want to thank you all for joining Ask Dr. Bob with me, Bob Gabbay, Chief Scientific and Medical Officer of the American Diabetes Association, answering your questions. Join us next time. Send us questions. Spread the word. And thank you for your support of the American Diabetes Association and for everything to make the world better for all of those affected by diabetes.